Join Scott in welcoming the good number of visitors we have this evening. We are studying a subject whereon I profess no neutrality, nor do I profess any lack of prejudice. I have strong faith in God and in His creative power and in His creative act. I believe that God created the heavens and the earth. But we are going to discuss the theory of evolution. And in discussing Darwinian evolution, we are going to examine a scientific theory that has dominated the thinking of science for the last 150 years. It is now being questioned. It is being challenged. And I am curious as I watch the discussions going back and forth, and they are not always very scholarly and objective. Scientists among themselves are using some strong language in criticizing one another's positions. And there are many who confront some of the scientific views that seem so arrogant with less than respect. And I don't know but what it is time to approach those views that way. I must try to be fair. I must do my best to be honest. But I claim no neutrality on this subject. I will listen to you if you disagree with what I say. I have read much of material that I disagree with, and I have discussed this subject with people that I disagree with. And I believe I am able to do it civilly. But this is not simply an academic exercise. It is a discussion of a subject that has consequences. Consequences for the salvation of man. For man understanding his purpose here. For man understanding what is after him. Truth, I hope, would change my mind if I do not know and understand truth. What I perceive to be truth, I believe to be utterly important, and I make no apology for that. To give you an idea of the kind of things that are going on today with regard to the theory of evolution, let me tell you something about just a few of the books that I have up here. This is a book entitled Adam and Evolution, written by Michael Pittman. You don't know Michael Pittman. He is not a citizen of the United States of America. He is a teacher of biology at Cambridge University in England. Several years ago, he was an evolutionist. And they were having some academic discussions in the science department at Cambridge. And they needed some people to take the creation viewpoint. And so, as he said, to play devil's advocate, he took the creationist viewpoint for the sake of discussion. And as the discussions continued, he came to prefer the creationist view. And he came to believe it. And he has written this book to express his views. This book is by a lawyer who was a law clerk of, what was his name now? He was a Supreme Court justice, not Warren Burger. Well, it's not important, but I can find it for you very quickly, I believe, and I'm wrong about being able to find it for you. But he is a professor of law at the University of California in Berkeley, California. And this is a review I came across in a magazine about the book. The book is called Darwin on Trial. And the review states this: Philip E. Johnson possesses credentials that would cow Perry Mason, and his cross-examination of the ideology of Darwinism is as devastating as any courtroom triumphs achieved by Earl Stanley Gardner's hero. Probably the analogy would be better drawn with Clarence Darrow in the dock. For Johnson does to Darwinism what Darrow purported to do to the anti-evolutionists at Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. He enlists the law, the disciplines of scientific investigation, and the tenets of reasoning in presenting the case that Darwinism is fraudulent as a scientific theory and characterized by a fundamentalism that exceeds in unreasonable passion even the fundamentalism of that much maligned fundamentalists. That is not modest in its claims about what he does to Darwinism. Devastates it is the idea. He indicates that it is fraudulent, and those are not gentle words. This is a subject that is creating a great deal of passion. It will not die an easy death, but die a death it will. In the 1960s, early, maybe the late 1950s, I bought a book called The Twilight of Evolution. And it was the beginning of some of my studies, and I found some good material in it. But I didn't ever read the introduction, and I wondered why he entitles his book The Twilight of Evolution. But it wasn't long until I understood. His thesis was, we now have enough information to thoroughly discredit what Darwin presented to the world and what by and large our universities have held to ever since. And surely enough, within a score of years, it seemed that Darwinian evolution was passing from the stage and new theories replaced them. Stephen Jay Gould, Professor Goldschmidt at the University of California, and their punctuated equilibrium ideas, holding that indeed the earth is not as old as the Darwinists claim. Even if it were that old, that is not enough time for all of the changes to take place that needed to take place from blue-green algae to humanity. And so the idea came to be that time and nature consisted in a status quo, and then in a short period of time, a great deal of change took place, and when it passed, things settled down again. And Professor Goldsmith put it this way. He said the first bird was hatched from a reptilian egg. Or to put it another way, as he said, one day an alligator laid an egg and a bird hatched from it. Well, I thought for a while that view was going to take this nation by storm. And the way people avidly grasped it seemed to me to indicate how bankrupt they saw Darwinian evolution to be. But it wasn't long till they were looking at that, and that came to be even more unbelievable than Darwinianism. And where things are going right now, I do not know. But I do know that scientists are looking for other answers. I do know there are some scientists who are not looking for other answers. They've written textbooks, their reputations are on the line, and they will go to their deaths denying the God who created them, and they will one day stand before him in judgment. And on the day of judgment, the theory of evolution is not going to be a very interesting discussion. But the discussion is in flux at the present time. There is much discussion taking place. Another book that I do not have was reviewed in the Washington Times just about a year ago, August 1992. The name of that book is The Facts of Life, Shattering the Myth of Darwinism. another book written by a bunch of fundamentalists. No, this man is an agnostic. He does not believe the Bible. He does not necessarily believe in creation. But he certainly does not believe in evolution. There's a science correspondent who is reviewing his book. The science correspondent is Neville Hodgkinson. Here's some of the things he says. The world of science this week faces the biggest challenge yet to one of its most basic beliefs, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. An authoritative compilation of scientific findings suggests that the theory, taught as gospel throughout the world, is so discredited, it should be abandoned as an elegant but unsupported myth. And I must tell you, I read the last word with a great deal of satisfaction. What I believe, I think there are good basic grounds for. I think there are reasons to believe the Bible. I think from a naturalistic viewpoint of what one can see in nature, there's reason to believe what the Bible teaches. And that has been scorned as myth. University professors have lost their jobs for not believing in evolution, but believing the Bible. And here from inside their own community, someone is challenging Darwinian evolution now as an unsupported myth. And I must pause here. This is like everything else that is politically correct today. You are not going to find this on your television programs and the sitcoms. And you're not going to find this on the evening news. The people who are in charge of the entertainment and news media have all been educated and fed intellectually at the same trough, and they scorn anything that does not fall in line with their presuppositions. It is going to be a long time before the public in general is aware of the ferment that is going on inside scientific circles this evening. The challenge comes from Richard Milton, a science writer, engineer, and amateur geologist, in a book entitled The Facts of Life, Shattering the Myth of Darwinism. Of Milton, it says, he has no creationist or other religious convictions. His book marshals discoveries indicating that the earth is much younger than the hundreds of millions of years needed for species to have evolved through chance mutations followed by natural selection. It also claims that Darwinism and subsequent modifications, punctuated equilibria, have failed to present conclusive evidence that one species can evolve into another. Well, I could spend my time this evening going through such material, but that will give you an idea of what is going on. This is quite a change from 1959, when the Centennial of Darwinism was celebrated in Chicago, Illinois. One of the speakers at that occasion was E.C. Olson, of course an evolutionist. And this is what he had to say even then. This is what he recognized even then. There exists as well a generally silent group of scientists who, while rejecting evolution, think it futile to argue the subject because it is so adamantly accepted. There is reason to believe their number is not inconsiderable. Or to state it another way, scientists who do not believe evolution, there is reason to believe their numbers are considerable. And in my experience in recent times, I believe this is so. I think there are men who go about their scientific disciplines, working for the betterment of mankind and improving our existence here upon this earth as far as things natural can, and devoting their lives to the study of natural things, who were taught evolution and graduating, they put it behind them, and they are concerned with their field of study and simply ignore the subject. But because of the objections that have been made, and because they're becoming sharper and more effective, and because they are hitting home, many others have joined the fray. And I expect that you young people in your lifetime will find some radically different explanations for our existence here upon this earth than have been believed for the past 130 or 40 years. Does that mean that man is going to turn back to God in faith? No. There will always be people who will seek God and who will look for something higher and nobler. But in general, man living in a sinful world, man will find himself rebellious and antagonistic to the idea of God, and he will look for explanations apart from the Bible to explain his being here. But I think I can see what the author of that book meant when he entitled his book, The Twilight of Evolution. I unashamedly believe what the Bible teaches. And as far as what has ever been scientifically demonstrated, there is not one thing along that line that the Bible is out of harmony with. It is radically out of harmony with the various theories of evolution. But as far as anything which can be substantiated and demonstrated, the Bible is not out of harmony with any of that. I go to Genesis, the first chapter, and verse 1, and read in the very beginning of the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I suppose the only time some people ever heard those words quoted was when Frank Borman and his fellow astronauts were orbiting the moon before heading back to Earth. At times, the camera would be pointed toward Earth, and Frank Borman read that passage. Jack Wiggin in this congregation spoke later to Mr. Borman about that. And he said, at that time, I could think of nothing better to say or to read. And since that time, I still can't think of anything better to have read at that moment, nor do I. And I can turn to Hebrews, the 11th chapter, and verse 3, and read that by faith we understand that the worlds have been framed by the word of God, so that the things that are made have not been made out of the things which are seen, or the things which are seen have not been made out of things which are seen. We now know that the basis of all matter is energy, which is not seen. Energy in a certain specific atomic form. Hebrews the 11th chapter stated that. And said God took that which is not seen and he made that which is seen. He framed the worlds. He rendered the worlds complete, the text says. Or to turn to an Old Testament passage, I invite you to the 33rd Psalm. I do not believe there is room for theistic evolution. I think there are people who have wanted some appreciation from the scientific world. They did not want to be looked upon as terribly benighted. They wanted to believe in God and accept scientific theory, so they believe that God began the process and evolution is how he let it develop. Those people are going to be left in the cold. They are not going to be with those who believe in God, and they will not be with those who want to hold on to evolution. But the theory of evolution is going to find its death and its demise. The Bible does not allow for that concept. In this passage, Psalm 33, verse 6, beginning by the word of Jehovah were the heavens made, and all the hosts of them by the breath of his mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea together as a heap. He layeth up the deeps in storehouses. Let all the earth fear Jehovah. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. There is a relationship between this awe that we ought to have in relationship to God and the creation. 4, he spake and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. The God who can speak this universe into being calls forth tremendous awe. And that is what this passage says. Or there's Romans, the 1st chapter, and verse 20, that tells us about the creation. It says, since the creation of the world, the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made, even his everlasting power and divinity. Through the things that are made, which we can see since the creation of the world, we can see some invisible things of God, his everlasting power and his divinity, the text says. There are reasons to believe the Bible that are sufficient and satisfying, and I believe it. And I believe that the theory of evolution was an attempt to ungod the world. Now, people may tell you that earlier in his life, Darwin was a theological student. And it is true, he studied some and cast it aside. But those who have studied his life see his rebellion and they see his concepts. And he wanted to explain this world without God. And I believe that that is still the impetus of the theory of evolution today, to explain the universe without God. What I've said in the last few moments is that what I accept by faith. I do not just say I decide to believe this. There is evidence, there are facts, there's information that persuades and convinces me, and I come to the conclusion. But I was not there when the first life sprang into being. Thus, I must accept by faith what happened. No evolutionist today was there at the beginning of the universe. He was not there when life first sprang into being, and he likewise must come to his conclusions by faith. And for the remainder of our time this evening, that is what I want us to center upon. That whether you accept the fact that God created the heavens and the earth, of that idea, or whether you accept the idea of Darwinian evolution, it is going to have to be accepted by faith. And as far as facts are concerned, my friend, there's not any doubt in my mind on which side the facts lie. And I hope I shall be able to present just a bit to you this evening, so that you can see when we are looking at facts that they are terribly out of harmony, as much that I read to you from these books indicates. The facts, or at least Darwinian evolution, is much out of harmony with the facts. Let us look at what evolution needs in order to be proved, or in order to be accepted as fact. I'm going to have to look up here, I think. Evolution needs a mechanism to initiate life from non-life. At some time or another in their scheme, there was no life. And somehow life had to come into being. From our discussion this evening, I hope we shall understand and see that is an utter impossibility. Evolution needs a mechanism to produce the new genetic material essential to new life forms. Genetics produces our physical characteristics. For a new physical characteristic to come into being, there has to be a gene to produce it. And there's not anything in Darwinian evolution or any other kind that can adequately explain that, as we shall see. And evolution needs the existence of evolutionary forms, living or fossilized. As Darwin said, if my theory is true, why is not all life filled with innumerable life forms in transition? I think that's a good question. Or failing that, why are not the transition forms found in every strata of the Earth's crust? I think that's a good question. I know when I was in school, though, the fossil record was put forth as one of the greatest evidences of evolution. I can tell you now that the evolutionist runs from the fossil record like he runs from nothing else. And that is one of the reasons they have had to come up with the new theory of punctuated equilibrium. That's what evolution needs. Here are the facts as we shall see them develop. There is no known mechanism which can bring life from non-life. If that's true. The evolutionist believes that life has come from non-life, but if there is no known mechanism which can bring life from non-life, he has to accept that, not upon the basis of fact, not upon the basis of anything he can prove. He has to accept that upon the basis of faith. There is no demonstrable mechanism to produce the new genetic material essential to new life forms. Some of the things we'll get back to are such as this. Before you had chordates, animals with spines, with backbones. In order to produce that, it isn't enough for some gene to mutate. You have to have a gene for some kind of backbone or spine. And when all you had were sightless worms, they did not have genes for spines, and there was no way for a gene for spines to come into existence. And that's what this point is saying. Nor has evolution shown any way to bring that kind of genetics into being. Or the eye. When the only creatures that were sightless, it was not enough for some gene which they possessed to mutate. There had to be a gene for sight that could mutate into an eye, and there was no gene for sight. Where did the new genes come from? The evolutionists cannot tell it. He believes it happened. Upon what basis does he believe it happened? He cannot demonstrate it. He cannot tell you the natural law by which it happened. He accepts it by faith. And then finally, there is no evidence of evolutionary forms of one kind of life evolving into another kind of life, living or fossilized. There is not one single life form that has been found in the fossil record to be in a transitional state, one kind of life in the process of evolving into another kind of life. Not one. Now, Stephen Jay Gould said, "Oh, I have proved evolution." And he goes to a reptilian jaw and he finds a bump on it. And he finds it moved further back on another kind of reptile later. And his presumption is that in higher animals we have the stirrup and the anvil in our ear, and that's where that came from. A bump here, a bump further back, and now we've got a stirrup and anvil in the ear, and he has proved evolution by that. I have to tell you, when I read his article where he said, "I have proved evolution and here is the evidence," it was with some trepidation. This is a man of some great standing, and that is his one proof from the fossil record that he has found one form of life changing into another form of life. Now that may satisfy some partisan who wants to ungod the universe and explain nature without God. I doubt if that satisfies very many people here this evening. When we are talking about evolution, I must explain what we are not talking about. I'm not talking about adaptation through natural selection. Adaptation is an observable fact of science, and a person would be foolish to disregard it. I remember even in 4th and 5th grade science classes learning about adaptability of life forms. And one outstanding illustration has been used in this century as proof of evolution. And we've talked about that here, and it is the peppered moth in England. Before 1850, the vast majority of peppered moths were white or light colored. But over those next 50 years, the population shifted, and there were very few light-colored ones, and all of a sudden there were many dark-colored ones, and that prevailed then for another 50 years. But surprisingly, in the past dozen or 15 years, the white moth population is growing again. But before that started, the evolutionists pointed at that and said, see, evolution. Light-colored moths, and they have changed into dark-colored moths. And now we understand why. There were light-colored trees abundant in England, and the light-colored peppered moths lit upon them, and they were not easily spotted by the birds. A dark-colored moth lit upon a birch tree, for instance, and he was easily picked off. He was not really fit to survive in that kind of climate, and his population dwindled. But with the coming of the Industrial Revolution and smoke and soot in the air, which darkened the trees, now the light-colored moth lights upon the tree, he is picked off, his gene pool is being reduced, the dark-colored moth upon the dark tree is not easily seen, he begins to populate. But when they begin to clean up their environment and the trees are clean again, here comes the white-colored moth back again. I wonder if evolution is going in reverse. Well, of course not, and I think any third grader in here this evening can understand what we have just said. But that idea and that fact of the light-colored peppered moth turning dark has been presented as evolution. I believe in adaptation through natural selection. And we are not talking about selective breeding. One of the outstanding examples that I think of is an experiment that was carried on for, 118 years. It started in France in 1800. And they started with a sugar beet that had 7% sugar. And each generation they would take the sweetest beets and the sweetest beets and sweetest beets. And by 1878, 78 years later, that sugar beet had reached its optimum, evidently, because it reached a portion of 17% sugar. But they continued the experiment for 40 years more until 1918, and there was no further change. But out of all of this manipulation to increase its efficiency, they used its genes and its genetic powers to the ultimate, and they went from 7% or 6% to 17% sugar, and then it stopped. But the fact is that with all that manipulation, it never did turn into an apple tree. It stayed a sugar beet, an improved sugar beet to be sure, and that was done by selective breeding. Nor do we deny that there are varieties that operate within certain bounds with great variety. And I can talk about the roses that I grow out here. And there are different colors, there are different sizes. Here are all of the things you can have in roses. There are loose petal roses, there are tight petal roses, there are high-centered roses and low-centered roses, there are yellow roses and red roses, there are dark green-leafed roses, there are light green-leaf roses, there are shiny-leaf roses, there are roses with many thorns, there are roses with few thorns, and you can combine all of those combinations. And you can achieve just almost an infinite variety of roses. You know, that's evolution. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But that's not Darwinian evolution. And the fact is that no matter how much they have worked to get these different kinds of roses out here and throughout the world, no rose plant has ever turned into a pine tree. And that's what we've got to have happen for evolution to transpire. When they talk about adaptation, when they talk about selective breeding, when they talk about varieties, they are not talking about what they need to talk about to prove their theory. Or I'm not talking about intelligently guided gene splicing, some magnificent things going on, taking genes from here, splicing it into that, and giving this plant a power that it never had before. But how did you do that? How did you do that? You took a gene for that power and you put it there. But what you did was take a gene that was already in existence. If you had a sightless worm There would have been no way to get a gene for sight and put it in a fish. Or there would have been no way to get a gene for spine and put it into a fish. To do gene splicing, you have to start with something. You have to start with genes. And what evolution needs to do is acquire new genes, not Levi's. They want homosexuals leading the Boy Scouts, so not that kind. Of course, you understand the kind of genes we're talking about. Evolution cannot produce that, but that's exactly what evolution needs to produce to be a viable idea and a viable theory. Well, the evolutionist has his explanation, though. We've said that evolution needs to show that life can come from non-life. He needs to show how, once life is in existence, these changes can occur naturally by themselves, going from the simple to the complex. And he needs to be able to show, either in living forms or forms who have lived in the past, that those changes have taken place. And he can do none of those things. But he still believes that life came from non-life. And here is his argument about how that happened. This. Oh, thank you, Drew. Given carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, amino acids may form. Well, wonderful. What is so important about amino acids? Well, amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Okay. Amino acids may form from these substances, and amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Well, cells need protein to grow and develop. Therefore, living cells develop spontaneously developed amino acids. Somehow or another, the right combinations of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen got together to make the right kind of amino acids. And they formed protein, and protein did what was necessary, and life came into being spontaneously. And that's the argument. Here's what they are asking you to believe. Given silicates, carbonates, water, and sand, bricks may form. Bricks are the building blocks of walls. Houses need walls to grow and develop. Therefore, houses develop spontaneously from spontaneously developed bricks. Here is a building. If I told you that's how this building came into being, we hear a lot of sirens out here. Sometimes it's fire trucks and sometimes it's ambulances, and you would know which one to call for me if I seriously suggested that. And yet, that's what's being taught in our textbooks. That's what's seriously believed by college and university professors. This building is not, with all of its electrical wire and plumbing and carpeting, which we hope to replace, is not nearly so complex as one single cell. When I was in college, I remember one of the assignments, draw a cell. Cell wall, nucleus, protoplasm, and not a lot more. Oh, but since I was in school, what we have decided and discovered about the complexity of the cell is amazing. But if this building can come into being or cannot come into being without design and following an intelligent plan, I would suggest that neither can a cell come into being just accidentally because some amino acids happened to get together. But to see that that didn't happen, and to see that that couldn't happen, I want us to take a look inside the cell. And what do we find? We find, first of all, amino acids inside the cell. As far as the significance of amino acids is concerned, let me read to you what an evolutionist says about amino acids, cells, and they're developing spontaneously from, or that is, cells developing spontaneously from amino acids. And I did this book today so it would fall open right where I wanted it, and it's not doing it, so you wait, there it is. Evolutionist J. Kiosian says that the simplest cell, listen, is an intricate unit of harmoniously coordinated parts and chemical pathways. It's spontaneous assembly out of the environment, and that's what the evolutionist has to have. He has to have a spontaneous assemblage of all of these things coming together under the right circumstances to form the cell. It's spontaneous assembly out of the environment, granting the unlikely simultaneous presence together of all of its parts. He's saying it's exceedingly unlikely you would get all of its parts just lined up together and they all say one day, you know, if we all get together, I'll bet we could be a cell. He says that's not likely to happen for them all to get together like that in the first place. And for them to spontaneously assemble, he says, is not a believable possibility. And yet he believes it happens. Now, my friend, when I say that evolution is faith, I'm serious about that. And it is not just a wild charge. If you cannot demonstrate it, if you cannot show that it has happened, if you cannot offer proof for it in some way, and yet you believe it, you are believing with a lot less faith than I have in the Bible, because I can show reasons to believe the Bible, and the only reason to believe spontaneous generation or that the cell just happened to poof into being is we are here. But there are other explanations as to how we got here, and it is not necessary to believe that, and I do not believe it can be a valid scientific conclusion. We have seen what is necessary, but looking at amino acids, it takes heat and other things to make certain amino acids. But what it takes to make those amino acids, which are in the cell, some of the other amino acids in the cell are destroyed by heat. And so to form them and get them together, what would create one would destroy the other, and yet there they exist in the living cell. And the fact is that these amino acids in the cell are found together only in the living cell. They cannot exist together outside of the living cell. And there are 20 different amino acids in the cell, and of course, there being chemical compounds, you can make them. Only some of them. There are 3 amino acids the cell cannot exist without that have not been able to be produced or formed after 30 years of avid trying. Not to mention just leaving everything alone and seeing if they can happen, but after working and doing everything that should produce those amino acids, they have not been produced. The only place they exist is in the cell. So the idea and the fact appears to be that bringing these amino acids together and having them in this cell, the cell had to exist first. The cell has produced them in that precise relationship. They did not produce the cell. But looking at further at what we find in the cell, there are lipids. And there is no way to chemically produce lipids. Lipids are only produced by life. As far as we know, as far as we can observe, lipids are only produced by life. Life then must come from life. There's a law that says that. It's the law of biogenesis. All life comes from previous life. Then there's porphyrin in the cells. Without porphyrin, the oxygen breaks down the chemicals in a cell. But the fact is that porphyrin needs free oxygen to come into existence. Some of the other things in the cell are destroyed by free oxygen. How in the world are they going to form and get together and operate? They find existence together only in a living cell. They could not have existed together to form the first cell. Then there is DNA, the twin spiral code in every cell of your body, there is this code which has all of the information to produce you and only you and specifically you all over again. But this DNA is what orders the protein to make other cells and the kind of cells they are to produce. So the protein, it is not necessary, or it is not enough just to have protein and suppose that you're going to have a cell. Protein has to be code guided, genetically guided. And the DNA tells the protein how to make other DNA, which says this: DNA is an essential part of the cell. It is how the cell reproduces. There is no reproduction without DNA, but it takes DNA to make DNA. So these chemicals could not simply get together and form life. There is a design there. These things fit together in impossible relationships that exist only in a living cell. A living cell has to produce or has to exist in order to produce other cells. Life, as we have said, comes from faith. So we have this problem for the evolutionists. There is no way for life spontaneously to come into being. I do not care how many amino acids you have, they are not going to produce a living cell. That leads us to the conclusion then that the evolutionist believes in something unseen and undemonstrated. His conclusion is a matter of faith. George Gaylord Simpson, a great evolutionist of the past, who was in the heyday of evolution, and he didn't have to be challenged, and he could think about the fossil record, and he didn't have to understand a lot of things that an evolutionist has to try to understand today. But he was a brilliant man. But he said this: it is inherent in any definition of science that statements that cannot be checked by observation are not really about anything, or at least they are not science. Statements which cannot be checked by observation are not science. And the idea that some amino acids got together and formed protein, and that protein and that this protein somehow developed genetic direction is something that has not been observed, it has not been seen. It is therefore, according to George Gaylord Simpson, not science. It is what we have charged it with being. It is a matter of faith. It is a matter of philosophy. It is not science. Murray Eaton, who is an evolutionist, says this in observing the theory: there are many undiscovered natural laws, physical, chemical, and biological. And yet, these undiscovered laws, physical, chemical, and biological, are at the very heart of evolution. Undiscovered, unobserved, undemonstrable laws are at the heart of evolution. It cannot then be scientific and conclusive. The evolutionist depends upon these laws that are yet undiscovered. That is, his conclusions are a matter of faith, not certitude. He has not seen those laws any more than I have seen God. I am not guessing that God is. I do not mean to say that faith is simply superstition. There has to be a reason for faith. There has to be an adequate reason for faith. I believe there is far more adequate reason for believing in God than there is in believing in the theory of evolution. What we have seen then is that life coming from non-life, life spontaneously coming into being, is not a scientific principle. It has not been demonstrated. It is utterly impossible, and thus it is a matter of faith that it happened, if it happened. But passing from the problem for the evolutionist of, first of all, getting life to come into being. If life somehow came into being, there is then no mechanism for naturally changing one form of life into a higher form. There is no mechanism to get a reptile to turn into a bird, for instance. Lamarck depended upon the transmission of acquired characteristics. Now let me explain that. Something happens to an individual form of life, and this brings about not only temporary change but permanent change. Somehow it affects the genetic makeup of the creature, and this acquired characteristic, this new quality, is genetically passed on to offspring. For instance, where, if birds came from reptiles, where did feathers come from? Well, Lamarckianism has an answer, and it is that after amphibious fish began to stand up so they could develop legs and become birds, the wind could strike them more directly, and eventually the wind frayed their scales, turning them into slivers, which thus turned into feathers. Suppose that happened to some creature. How do wind-injured scales get into the genetic system so that the next creature is born possessing not just wind-injured scales, but full-blown feathers somewhere down the line? There is no way to explain that. Let me give you some examples. Centuries of cutting the hair has not transformed the genetic system so that men are now born with short hair. Centuries of shaving day after day after day after day has not somehow transformed into beardless individuals. And there are scientists who went through generations of mice, cutting off their tails, every generation, but the little mice kept being born with tails. If they had simply thought and used their minds, they had a dramatic example before them in 4,000 years of Hebrew circumcision. And yet, every little Jewish baby born, male child born, is still born in need of circumcision. This is a flawed principle, a flawed idea with insufficient thinking behind it, this idea of the transmission of acquired characteristics. But it has been believed in avidly and fervently. Let me tell you a story. There was a man in the early part of this century named Che Guevara, and he made a trip to Antarctica with this mission in mind, along with his friends, to find penguin or emperor penguins, whom he considered to be quite primitive, and to gather some of their eggs and bring them back for study, because he believed in embryonic recapitulation, or that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Now, you don't have to remember that. I'm not going to give you a test about that. But it is the idea that in the embryo of a human being, it goes through the fish stage, it goes through the pig stage, it goes through the ape stage, and finally becomes a human being. It goes through the entire process of evolution. This has been discredited. It has been proved to be not so, and yet it can still be found in textbooks. But his theory was this, and if the theory were so, this is what he should have found. He should have found in the emperor penguin eggs, since they have scales on their feet and feathers on their body, that the scales formed first, and that scales formed on the body and then turned into feathers. Mr. Gerard literally risked his life and those of his friends. Their treacherous journey was miserable. They were in extreme cold, dwelling one night in their tent where the temperature was only 27 degrees below zero with all the clothing they had on. There was some perspiration that gathered upon the body. Putting his head outside the tent the next morning and raising it to look around, The collar and his clothing froze around his head, holding it in that high suspended position, and he had to travel the next 4 hours with his head in that position. It was so cold, his teeth chattered so that it destroyed the nerves in his teeth, and his teeth cracked and he lost his teeth. There were times when they nearly lost their lives. There were many perils, frostbite, great injury, and yet they got their emperor penguin eggs. They brought them back, delivered them to the Natural Museum section of the British Museum to have the eggs studied. And the news for them was not good. Not only did the scales not turn into feathers, but the feathers formed on the body first before scales formed on the feet. And so that perilous journey, wasting their energies, doing them harm because they believed in a principle which simply was not so. Again, to illustrate, have you ever wondered if man descended from apes or from a common ancestor? What happened to the tail? Well, the Lamarckians told us that is, the apes became more social as they became higher beings and they began to sit around in social intercourse, conversing, or whatever was a precursor to conversation, that the more they sat, the tails simply wore off. They became scruffy and then gone. Or to put it another way, the apes sat their tails off and became men. Well, the transmission of acquired characteristics is not a sufficient explanation of how reptiles became birds, or how any other form of life became another form of life. But passing to that, or from that, Darwin said there is another principle, that of natural selection, or the survival of the fittest. And with the fittest surviving, their genes are passed on to their offspring, and their offsprings are fit offsprings. That is a principle of science. I do not know that anyone would object to that, but can that explain evolution and reptiles turning into birds? Darwin gave as his example the giraffe and its long neck. There must have been decades or scores of years or hundreds of years of drought on the African plains where they lived. And the giraffes had to stretch their necks to eat the leaves on the limbs, and eating them they had to stretch more to get the higher leaves, so that only the long-necked giraffes survived, and those long-necked giraffes passed their genes, which gave them their long necks, to their offsprings, and so you had long-necked giraffes developing. There are several things that are a problem there. One is this: the female has a neck 30 centimeters shorter than the male giraffe. If the male giraffe had to have his long neck to survive, the female giraffe did not make it. And if you want to get rid of giraffes, you get rid of the female giraffes. Or what about the baby giraffes when they finished nursing? They were not even as long-necked as their mothers. How did they live? And of course, the fact is that Darwin is explaining something that doesn't need explaining. We don't know anything about a truly short-necked giraffe, but he is working with a fanciful principle trying to explain evolution. For instance, it's like the professor standing in his classroom one day and explaining the evolution of the horse, believing that the horse came from the little creature Eohippus. We now know that it didn't. Using evolutionary time scales, we have found fully formed, mature horses that lived hundreds of thousands of years before Eohippus did. Little Eohippus was just a little kind of animal, somewhat similar to a horse, but quite different genetically, who became extinct. He is not in the family of the horses did not come from him. But the professor, believing that, was explaining that tigers feeding upon the horses necessitated the horses growing longer legs to escape from the tigers, and thus horses developed long legs. But one of the students was thinking and raised his hand, and he said, "Sir, the tigers depended upon the horses for food, is that correct?" And the professor said, "Yes." And he said, if the horses developed longer legs so they could run faster, why didn't the tigers develop longer legs so they could keep up with the horses? And I think that is an apt question. The fact is about natural selection, or survival of the fittest, natural selection eliminates the unfit. That is not evolution with a big E. That is not macro evolution. That does not explain how reptiles became birds. What evolution needs is something that originates new genetic material, new features, new qualities that have not been seen in the whole realm of nature before. Natural selection cannot do that. It can only eliminate the unfit. It does not originate new life forms. That led then Charles Darwin, or at least Darwin's disciples in this century, to choose another principle to combine with natural selection, and that is mutation. Mutations, and then natural selection sorts out and decides which mutations should survive. But the fact is, mutations are not helpful. Mutations are harmful. Julian Huxley, an evolutionist, said probably only 1 in 1,000 is helpful. Actually, there are other scientists who admit that above the molecular level there has never been found a genetic mutation which is helpful. Let me illustrate. Here is a little rat running around, and he is in the process of becoming a bat. While he is a rat and sleek, he can skin up the trees, he can run where he wants to go, he can slip through places and escape from his enemies. He is quite agile and he is fit for survival. But there sprouts out on either side of him little protrusions that grow larger, and while he is still a fat, heavy little animal, and while he has these protrusions from his side before they enable him to fly, here he is trying to climb through bushes, and they would snag on bushes. The fact is that an animal in the process of mutation, before the qualities and features are fully formed, would be unfit for survival. A partially formed bat with wings, unable to fly, would not be as fit to survive as the rat or rodent supposedly from which it came. This is not a sufficient principle, and it is a flawed principle. For when a gene mutates, it produces an alternate form of the structure or condition it produced before. For instance, a mutation might cause a child to be born without his upper arm, and his elbow is attached to his shoulder. That is a mutation. He may be born with a deformed hand, a deformed foot. Those are mutations. A mutation only alters a form or quality that is already there. That is not sufficient for evolution. Evolution has to have something that produces new qualities. The beak on a bird, the feathers on a bird, the eye before there was ever an eye. This is what evolution needs, and mutation cannot satisfy that. A new gene, new genetic information to go from reptiles to birds. Are you familiar with the name Drosophila? That's a little fruit fly. And scientists have been working on him, evolutionists have been working on him for 60 years. You can go through many generations in 1 week. This is the reason they chose him, and they have bombarded him with radiation to bring about genetic mutation. And they have succeeded. They have changed the pattern in his wing webbing. They have changed his eye color from one to another. They have caused a foot to grow where a mouth is. But the fact is, he is still a fruit fly. Little Drosophila never did become a honey bee. And that's what evolution needs. Not simply a deformed creature, not simply a deformed characteristic of what was there before. Evolution needs to bring something new into existence. Well, what about depending upon mutations to explain evolution? Listen to Ernest Houghton, who believes that some kind of evolution must have taken place. He cannot explain it, but he says this: saltatory evolution by way of mutation is a very convenient way of bridging over gaps between animal forms. Now, I am afraid that many anthropologists, including myself, have sinned against genetic science and are leaning upon a broken reed when we depend upon mutations. That quotation can be amplified. It can be multiplied time and time again. Mutations have not produced birds from reptiles, men from apes, fish from the sea worms, or the sea worms from algae. Mutations have not performed that. That has led to a new theory called punctuated equilibrium. The idea is that there was a status quo in life, and that through some strange happening at a particular period, there was an upset of nature that produced new creatures almost suddenly upon the earth. Why do we want this sudden evolution rather than gradual evolution? To explain why, there is no record of evolution in the fossil record. There are no intermediate forms. There is no record of one form of life changing into another form of life. As someone said, this perhaps is the only scientific theory that was ever formed to explain why there is no evidence for it. But that is punctuated equilibria. And it led Professor Goldschmidt at the University of California at Berkeley to say, an alligator laid an egg and it hatched a bird, or others, the first bird hatched from the egg of a reptile. And here was born what has been called by Stephen Jay Gould a hopeful monster, completely different from its parents. What happened genetically to bring this into being, no one knows, but here it is. And these hopeful monsters sorted themselves out by natural selection, and some proved themselves fit to survive, and very quickly in geologic history then gave us a new life form. May I ask you this? How many times in history has that been observed? And the answer is none. How many times have we found evidence that that has happened in the fossil record? And the answer is none. Historically, there is no evidence for this, so it must be exceedingly rare. Now, think with me for a moment. If this exceedingly rare thing did occur, and there hatched this little hopeful monster from the egg of a reptile, in order to continue itself, what must it find? It must find another hopeful monster developing at the same time, and not only another hopeful monster developing at the same time, but another hopeful monster of the opposite sex. And as rarely as that has happened, and there's no evidence that has ever happened, so that it must be exceedingly rare, then what are the chances that two occurred at the same time and conveniently of the opposite sex? Punctuated equilibria is lacking a source of new genetic information. All of evolution is, it needs more than just mutant genes which deform, mutant genes which bring into existence new characteristics. And we saw Ernest Houghton a while ago saying that this supposition is leaning upon a bruised reed. Let me read to you what Francis Hitching, another evolutionist of some sort, but he does not have any idea how it worked. It simply must have happened somehow. But he looks at Darwinism in his book, The Neck of the Giraffe, and asks the question, was Darwin wrong? And this is what he says about genetics. Now remember, in evolution, genetics must produce new, unseen, unknown qualities, develop them, and pass them on. Is that the function of the genetic system of DNA? No. Listen. The main function of the genetic system is one of renewal, of maintenance, renewing what is there, of maintaining what is there, maintenance of the status quo, of establishing limits to change. This is what the genetic system does, not develop new features and qualities and characteristics, but to establish limits to change. The genetic system, as its first priority, conserves, blocks, stabilizes. Well, let me read. The consequences of this ignorance have been far-reaching. For scientific creationists, it confirms their belief that there must surely have been a great designer for living organisms. There is no other way, they say, to overcome the statistical odds. For other biologists, less supernaturally inclined, the sheer intractability of the problem has led to skepticism. Skepticism about evolution. Ernest Chain, who won a Nobel Prize for research into the curative properties of penicillin, said in 1970, the postulate that the development and survival of the fittest is entirely a consequence of chance mutations seems to me a hypothesis based on no evidence and irreconcilable with the facts. He said there is no evidence for mutation performing new forms of life. He says, indeed, it is irreconcilable with the facts. Now, what does that make of the theory of evolution? It is not science. It is philosophy. It is faith. And he continues, these classical evolutionary theories are a gross oversimplification of an immensely complex and intricate mass of facts, and it amazes me that they are swallowed so uncritically and readily and for such a long time by so many scientists without a murmur of protest. The only reason they accept it is all they have, except God created man in his own image. That puts a sovereign in the universe, that puts rules into the universe for the behavior of man, and that is totally unacceptable to them, and thus they will swallow many unscientific principles to bolster this theory of evolution. Well, let's ask the question then, is evolution proven? Here is an outstanding scientist in England, and there are many in England who seem to be a lot more honest than those in the United States. This is G.A. Kerkut of the Department of Physiology and Biochemistry of the University of Southampton. He has written some important works on applied biology. And he says this, may I here humbly state as part of my biological credo that I believe that the theory of evolution as presented by orthodox evolutionists is in many ways a satisfactory explanation of some of the evidence. At the same time, I think that the attempt to explain all living forms in terms of an evolution from a unique source, though a brave and valid attempt, is one that is premature and not satisfactorily supported by present-day evidence. The theory of evolution, while he believes it, is not satisfactorily supported by present-day evidence. We can, if we like, believe that such an evolutionary system has taken place, but I, for one, do not think it has been proved beyond all reasonable doubt. And there are doubts out there today among honest scientists. Let me tell you of one, Colin Patterson, the chief paleontologist of the British Museum. And he came to the United States November 5th, 1981. And he assembled many notable scientists at the Museum of Natural History over here by Central Park in New York City. And he said to them, after 20 years of advancing this theory, I woke up one morning and realized I didn't know anything for sure about evolution. And I asked myself, what do I know for sure about this theory? And he said, I don't know anything for sure. So I am asking you, what do you know for sure about evolution? And of all of those renowned scientists assembled there, do you know what the response was? That. Silence. There was not a word. Not one of those scientists was willing to venture that he knew anything for sure about evolution. Well, Mr. Patterson went to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. He repeated the question before another renowned audience of scientists. And the response was exactly the same. And he went to the University of Chicago and asked the same question. And the answer was the same. Now, this man, all of these scientists to whom he posed the question, none of them know anything for sure about evolution. But they did come to one conclusion based upon this demonstration, and it was that evolution should not be taught in our schools as fact. But it is taught that way for political reasons, for philosophical reasons, and our courts have leaned that way because that is their philosophical bias. But we have seen ample evidence throughout this lesson and this study and this information that it is not scientific. There is more evidence. In 1966, at the Wistar Institute of Anatomy in Philadelphia, there was a meeting of 35 of the world's most renowned scientists, and they met there to discuss this theory. And this is a report from the Philadelphia Bulletin, April 27, 1966. Some 35 of the world's most renowned scientists argued to the point that they shed coats and loosened ties. When the battle was finished, Darwin's theory had been badly battered. Darwin's theory had been badly battered. But scientists failed to come up with a better one. By agreement at the beginning, there was no discussion of the influence of God or any form of supreme being. And without that, they badly battered their own theory, but did not come up with anything better. This symposium was entitled Mathematical Challenges to Neo-Darwinian Interpretation of Evolution. And the opening words at the first session were these by Sir Peter Medawar, who chaired that session. There is a pretty widespread dissatisfaction about what has come to be thought of as the accepted evolutionary theory in the English-speaking world, the so-called Neo-Darwinian theory. Widespread dissatisfaction. The mathematicians, the physicists in this meeting, presented the problems that the evolutionists, the biologists, had to face. They had worked with computers extensively upon a time scale that would allow all of these changes to take place. And even the long periods of billions of years postulated by the evolutionists was not nearly enough time. Marcel P. Schutzenberger of the University of Paris proposed that, and he says, "We find that we have no chance. Concerning the computer, it just jams. Thus, to conclude, we believe that there is a considerable gap in the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, and we believe this gap to be of such a nature that it cannot be bridged within the current conception of biology." He said the conception of biology is going to have to change. Mathematics demands that. Dr. Waddington, who was the chair, said to him in great irritation, "We are not interested in your computers." But as Professor Schutzenberger tried to continue, the biologist heckled him and shouted him down and would not let him continue. So much for scientific investigation and the scientific method. Well, what we've got is this. How did life come into being? Without an everlasting life, a life that has always been there and intelligent enough to bring the necessary forces together to create life, there is no scientific way to explain that. To believe that it happened is to have faith in missing laws to explain life coming from non-life. It is faith in missing laws where there is the transmission of DNA or where new DNA is formed originating new genes to allow an alligator to develop the characteristics of a bird. That is why we say evolution is not science. Evolution is a theory. It is a faith. A faith in missing laws to explain life from non-life. A faith in missing laws to tell us how an alligator changed into a bird. And what we shall see tomorrow evening is it is faith in missing information in the fossil record. Tomorrow night we shall look at apes that supposedly somehow became men. We shall look at the fossil record and see what evolution is there. We shall talk about dinosaurs and when they lived. But I want to close with these words. They are about a book written not long ago called The Evolution of Life. And the book was written by a man named Pierre P. Grasset. I want to read to you a review of this book by Professor Dobzhansky, who is an evolutionist, and he says this: "This book of Pierre P. Grasset is a frontal attack on all kinds of Darwinism. Its purpose is to destroy the myth of evolution as a simple understood and explained phenomenon," and that is a quote from the book. Here is a scientist writing. He has written a book to destroy the myth of evolution as a simple understood and explained phenomenon, and to show that evolution is a mystery about which little and perhaps none can be known. And Dobzhansky then comments, "Now, one can disagree with Grasset, but not ignore him. He is the editor of the 28 volumes of the Traits of Zoology, author of numerous original investigations, and ex-president of the Academy of Sciences in France. His knowledge of the living world is encyclopedic." I'm not quoting a nobody. I'm not quoting someone out on the fringe. I'm quoting someone from the heart of science. And this is the closing sentence of his book. "It is possible that in this domain, biology, impotent, yields the floor to metaphysics." What he is saying is that life as it exists today and its origination and development cannot be explained by biology. perhaps we need to look to a metaphysical explanation or an explanation beyond the natural laws that we have in operation at the present time. And I can tell him where to begin to look. He can go to Genesis, the 1st chapter, and verse 1 and read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Thank you.